Yeah? So how do you explain this? Where you can say, well, either the sound is coming from within the radio, like a cassette player, or it's picking up these radio waves, and you can prove it. So in that sense, somehow we are, I don't know to what extent animals are spiritually sensitive or able to pick up the spiritual world, but there's some way in which human beings somehow, because of our brain or whatever it is, we're able to interact with the spiritual world in some way. And also this idea of a microcosm of the universe. So this is a little bit more interesting, well, for me anyway, this idea of the microcosm of the universe. So there are lots of different levels in the cosmos in which we live. So at the very basic level, and everything is an expression of God. So at the very basic level, we look at minerals, and you study minerals. You can see that minerals are made up of atoms and molecules and particles, which, as we looked at before, have an inherent directive nature. And so when people study nature at this level, you study it through physics and through chemistry. Yeah? And there is a sense among some scientists that you ought to be able to explain everything just in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry. Yeah? When we look at the world in which we live, we can see there's another level, the level of plants. And plants have an external form, the cellular body, and then some kind of inherent internal nature. And the question is then, is it possible to explain, and so what subject studies plants? Biology and botany, these kind of subjects, yeah? And the question is then, is it possible to explain all the ways that a plant behaves in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry? Is it possible to explain chemistry just in terms of the laws of physics? Is it possible to explain botany just in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry? Or not? Hmm?
That's why you have the other subjects.
Yeah, so there is a sense then that there are different levels at which you study things. And so, if you look at DNA, for example, DNA is an extremely complicated molecule, but also it's the bearer of information. So when people are trying to understand what is the basis of life, there were two streams within science who were trying to understand it. One were the sort of people interested in genetics and information, and the other who are interested from a chemical point of view, what is the chemical basis of life. When you unravel DNA, is it possible from studying the DNA to what can you actually explain by looking at the DNA?
What can you explain when looking at DNA?
Right. So can you predict what kind of properties are going to emerge from a particular combination of the molecules that DNA is made up of?
Yes, you can.
Can you?
Well, they're learning about it, so they're still researching.
So how's it working? How does it work?
Well, they don't know how it works.
No, how does
They know how it works.
Right, so how does the studying it work?
Well, I think it means they're like signals of what is going to happen, or predictors. They can see them as predictors or identify them as predictors.
Okay, so you got these four base pairs, yes, which are made up of molecules, and these molecules are made up of atoms. So if you were to study the nature of these atoms, could from just knowing what these elements are, could you predict then how these elements will combine to form a particular molecule, and how these molecules will combine to form a particular base pair, and from that how this particular base pair would influence the colour of a person's eyes?
I don't think they've got that far.
Is it possible to do that, do you think?
Not from first principles.
Well, that's the thing. Is it possible that physics can explain biology? So, for example, what they do is they find out which particular genes are connected to which particular characteristics. Yes, but just by studying the gene itself, just by studying the chemical structure of the DNA, they cannot predict it. What they do is they look at the characteristic and they find out what characteristic does this come from, which particular part of the gene does it come from. But just by studying the gene itself, you can't predict. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they do it by trial and error, don't they? Like they
Yes, by
look at
trial and error,
see
yes.
what happens, yeah.
So there are lots of things. Anyway, so the genes then, it conveys information, and you can't actually explain and articulate that information in the terms of the laws of physics and chemistry.
It's a bit like Chinese medicine, isn't it? They analyse the ingredients in Chinese medicine and try and work out what the active ingredient is.
Uh-huh.
And they use that, and then they find they don't get the same result, even though it's the active ingredient. There's some other elements in there which they don't understand.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when we look at an animal then, it also has an outer form, a body, and an instinct. And, the instincts. So when you study when you study animals, it's zoology. Yeah, so when you look at animals, for example, you look at a wolf, you study it and you find that wolves have a social life. Now, is it possible to predict the social life of a wolf by studying the wolf's DNA? Is it possible to predict, just from the laws of physics, how a wolf is going to behave in terms of its social life? So these idea of what you call emergent properties. You can't actually reduce everything to the level of physics. When you move to another level, you get laws which interact on them. So as I said, what decides where a particular molecule's... Have you heard of, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle? You can't actually predict where a particular electron is going to be. And if you actually look at, the electrons in my arm, it's impossible to predict where they're going to be. But it's also possible for me to move my arm. Yeah? So actually, when you look at the very lowest level, from that you can't predict the higher level things. You know what I mean? So there's sort of higher level laws which kind of, I'm not very good at explaining all this. Anyway. And we look at a human being. We could say we have a physical aspect, our physical body, and also a spiritual aspect. So, can you explain all of human behavior in terms of the laws of physics? No. Can you explain all of human behavior in the terms of the laws of chemistry? Can you explain human behavior in terms of the laws of biology? You can explain quite a lot, but there's a limited amount you can explain. Can you explain human beings in the same way you can explain any other animal? What's the difference between trying to explain and understand human beings to understanding other animals? What sort of differences are there?
Well, there's some choices. I mean, animals are predictable.
Yeah, fairly predictable.
But human beings are not.
So when you read books about animals, what kind of title might the book have? You might have a book about tigers, yeah, and it'll tell you all sorts of things about tigers. But when you think about the human world, what kind of books might you have which describe the human world?
Different aspects of race.
Sorry?
Different aspects of society, race, and culture.
Yes, and so, yeah, for example, you'd have the history of human beings in a particular country. You wouldn't have that about any other animal, would you? Or you'd have biographies of individual human beings. Now, is it common to have a biography of the life of an individual human animal? Sorry, of an individual animal. You don't do it. You just look at the species as a whole. There's very little distinction between different ones, unless they happen to become a pet, in which case somebody might write the biography of my pet cat or some particular significant animal. But generally speaking, you don't write those kind of books. Whereas as human beings, you can actually write a book about the life of every human being, and it would be quite different, or pretty different. So that's different. And also you have this, as you're saying, you might study if you want to understand the human world, you study culture, you'll study art, you'll study philosophy, you'll study history, you'll study sociology, So all these are lots of different ways in which you're trying to make sense of what human beings are. So you look at human beings from a sociological point of view, to try to explain how they behave. You look at them from a historical point of view to try to explain how they behave. Look at them from a philosophical, religious point of view to try and explain how they behave. You look at them also, of course, from a biological point of view, and you get people who say, well, the reason why Churchill made a particular decision is because he happened to be drunk on that day. You know, sometimes people try to reduce things down, oh, Napoleon had a particular illness and that explains all these sorts of things about him. That's a sort of more of a reductionist kind of approach. But to try and explain human beings, you can do it at many, many, many different levels. You can explain, when you're studying science at school, you look at the digestive system, you look at all these different things. You can explain about the biology of a human being, but that only explains about the physical side, which isn't all that different from looking at the biology of a cat, or the biology of a monkey, or the biology of an elephant. It's not all that different. But when you take into account the spiritual aspect or spiritual dimension of humanity, of a human being, you've got this whole other realm which we study in order to try to understand it.
So there's a difference between metaphysics and physics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So physics is all about sort of literally physical laws.
Yes.
Metaphysics is
It's
about,
philosophy.
yeah.
Yes.
Because that imposes an aspect on all of these areas.
Yes. Yeah, and metaphysics basically is philosophy. Yeah, what is the nature of reality, what exists. Yeah. Anyway, so as I said, you can't reduce human beings to the laws of physics or to the laws of plants or the laws of zoology. Yeah? So there are lots of different levels in which you have to explain it. So you get all these different emergent properties then, which makes it much more difficult to explain human beings. Okay, so in that sense, we're a microcosm of the cosmos. We have all these things, but also we're more than just... In that sense, the whole is more than the sum of the parts, this idea. Okay, what are the different stages of life? Well, we get this idea here. We are conceived and we grow and live within the womb and spend about 40 weeks living on the placenta. And then we grow. And so life in the womb then is preparation for physical life, of the physical self. And then supposing, it's hard to imagine, just imagine you were living in your mother's womb. What do you think it would be like? Warm and cozy and lots of space. You can go for swimming and back crawl and front crawl and breaststroke. And you don't have to, you're never hungry. It's warm and, cozy and everything. But after a while, how does it feel? You feel a bit squashed, yes. Yeah, not much space in here anymore. I need bigger accommodation. And then suddenly, one day, somebody lets out the plug. Hey, what happened to all the water? It's all drained, and suddenly you feel you're being compressed. I'm getting squashed. It's like being in a sort of one of these dustbin, lorries are getting compressed, and you're getting squeezed out. You see there's a bit of light down at the end of this tunnel. You think, I can't fit down through that. And you feel probably like you're going to die. And suddenly you come out, and it's all this bright light, and it's, it's harsh air, and, then it's fun, you start having to, breathe, which is hard work. And then suddenly somebody goes snip, hey, that's my food supply you've just cut off there. And then suddenly it starts to, within a few minutes, I suppose, I can't remember how long now, you start to feel hungry, which you never felt before. And so this life in this new world isn't as pleasant as the life in the old world. So it feels like dying. But actually, it's entering into this new world, where we have a physical body, which has been prepared while we were in the womb, and we have a mind and a spirit self, and we live on this world for, anything from 1 day to 120 years. And when you get old, and your physical body doesn't seem to work as well as it used to, and after a while, it also feel like dying. Well, because you are dying. Then when you die, you go into the spiritual world, have a spiritual body and a spiritual mind. And so the whole purpose of this world, just as the purpose of being in the womb was to prepare for this world, the purpose of this world is to prepare for the next world. And so all the things you can learn to do in this world, you can do in the next world. And I often think it's a bit like the Matrix. You remember when Trinity's trying to fly that helicopter? She can't do it, can she? So what does she do? Yeah, she said, please, what's his name? Please install the program. He installs a program and she can fly. And I often thought, wow, that's like the spiritual world. Everything which we learn how to do in this world, we'll be able to do in the next world. So this world is a world for installing lots of programs. So when we get to the next world, we can play all these games. So often I think that's what Father does. Father tries to do everything. He tries his hand at everything. So I'm thinking that's what he's doing. He's trying to learn how to be able to do everything. So when he goes to the next world, he can have fun, doing all sorts of different kinds of things, going to all sorts of different kinds of places. And so in that sense, developing his potential to the max. And so I think we should do the same sort of thing. Because when we're in this world, our body after a while starts to become a limiting factor. As much as I used to enjoy playing rugby when I was at university, I wouldn't dream. I wouldn't dream of doing anything other than watching in front of a television anymore. Because it's, one just can't do it. But I'm sure in the next world, I'll be able to get my boots on and be in the line out and having fun again. So that's the way it is, these different stages of life. So how does spiritual growth take place? Well, it's about the relationship between the spiritual body and the physical body. So we look at our physical body, how does that develop? Well, for a physical self, in order to develop, it needs to have light from the sun. Then what happens if you don't have light? You turn out very anemic, don't you? And pale. You need to go and lie in the sun a bit. Yeah? Otherwise you fade away. So you need warmth and light from the sun. You need to breathe, you need to eat food, you need to drink water, you need to take some exercise, and your physical body will naturally grow. And so you can say, you need both. You need all of these in order to be able to grow all these elements. So when we look at the spiritual self, by analogy, you could say that God is like the sun. By analogy, we need truth, which is like spiritual light. So we have this metaphor: when you shed light upon the situation, when you say somebody shed light upon the situation, they explain to you what's going on. Now you understand. Yeah? The truth is like a spiritual light. God's love is like a spiritual warmth. And so we need God's love, we need God's truth in order to be able to grow spiritually. And so that's why people spend time studying the scriptures and also praying. And then from God then we receive these life elements. But also we need to get other kinds of elements. Those are positive, but also we need negative vitality elements to balance it out. So if you spend all your time reading and praying all day, will you become a perfect person? If you spend all your time, you memorize all the scriptures off by heart, you receive lots and lots of love, will you actually grow? You only grow to a certain level, because you also need vitality elements, negative vitality elements as well. And we get these vitality elements by using our physical body to do good things. When we not just receive love, but when we give love, we practice love, then by using our physical self to help others, the old classical, help the old lady to cross the road, live for the sake of others, do good deeds, then our physical self gives vitality elements to our spiritual self, and our spiritual self feels good. Our spiritual self becomes very bright. And so even though our physical self gets very old, our spiritual self can still become very bright. And so, if you think of somebody like the Queen Mother, would her face have been used for advertising beauty creams? No, why not?
Aging cream.
Aging cream. Why? It's just a mass of wrinkles, isn't it? So what do most people want to do? Most people put all this cream on to try and stop themselves getting wrinkles. And if you looked at her teeth, they're a little bit on the crooked side. But even though on that side she was full of wrinkles and had crooked teeth, actually people loved her very much, because had a life of public service such that, had a very bright spirit that, that shone through her ugly, face in that sense. And so that's, the way it is. And so that's what Jesus said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. So just like we need physical food, we need spiritual food, which is doing good deeds. Now, our spiritual self then returns spiritual elements to our body, which helps us to feel alive. And if you do good things for other people, you actually feel alive. You feel you've got more energy. But if you live a very selfish life, then actually you've got no energy. You can become completely lethargic and apathetic. But through actually generating and doing things for others generates energy. And the more you help others, the more energy you've got to do things to help others and to do good things. But also, in our spirit to grow, we need an atmosphere of freedom to grow up in, and of culture, of music, where we can, intellectual freedom, we can explore ideas and things. In order for our spirit to grow then. So, good or evil, it says in the principle, in the conduct of the physical self is the main determinant of whether the spirit self becomes good or evil. So depending upon how we use our life, how we live our life, if we live a very selfish life, using other people for ourselves, then we become a bad person, develop a corrupted spirit. If on the other hand we live for the sake of others, we try to make others happy, instead of trying to get others to make us happy, then our spirit becomes bright and good. And we need both. What happens if we just have vitality elements, but we don't have life elements? Can you think of somebody who may get lots of vitality elements but doesn't get any life elements?